So, hello everyone. I think identity is a very hard thing to wrap your head around, and I kind of feel like we're living in, I don't know, maybe the equivalent would be 100 years ago when there was some eccentric people walking around saying, we're going to have electrical outlets in every room. There's going to be electricity going into everyone's house that they can use to power things, you know? And on this side of having built that infrastructure, it doesn't sound like a utility. You're like, what is this utility you're imagining where people can pay a few cents to have some fact checked by another person that they don't know in some decentralized way? Why has this got to be so cryptographically complicated? But it's an we should think of this as a utility that we will not be able to imagine our life before once it's here, much like these outlet things that most of us don't remember visiting a place without. I think it's important to bounce back and forth between different perspectives when you're imagining future businesses, future business models, future, I don't know, life ways. We're talking about infrastructure here. We're talking about setting up software that does something that is not currently possible. The decentralized part is insanely confusing, even more confusing than the cryptography, I find, for a lot of non-specialists. So I'm gonna present on ways to get up to speed on whatever part of this is the hardest for each of us, right? Because I fell in love with this stuff 2 years ago and have been just sort of researching my way through it with little background, and I think that's what a lot of us are going to need to do to get on this electrification train, you know? So yeah, I'll try not to quote Lenin. Okay, so I'm representing two projects here. Okay, so building identity stuff now is kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? So we think of identity as an infrastructure that is different parts of it are in different stages of not yet existing, there's not a manual you can check, there's not a product you can buy. A lot of this stuff to work, all the other parts of it have to work. We're like imagining a totally different stack. The metaphor that gets kicked around a lot, I think it was Christopher Allen who said it first, there's no identity layer in the classic 8-layer stack, and building one is very hard. Building a decentralized one is even harder. The discovery thing, there's a lot of complexity condensed in that word discovery. So if something is decentralized, how do you find out about the person halfway around the world doing it? It's kind of like one metaphor people use a lot is how many people have ever used like onion addresses or Tor addresses? Is that not a lot of dark web drug traders here? Okay. If you want to buy drugs illegally on the dark web, you have these sort of addresses that are sort of arbitrary. They're kind of like hashes. They're one-way addresses. They leak no information. It just looks like gibberish, and you can't guess them, and you can't memorize them. You have to know in advance the address. So if you're doing something dark webby, you inevitably have to go on the not dark web to distribute the address. The discovery is the tricky part. Same is true of a lot of dApps, a lot of Web3 stuff. All of these new decentralized technologies are having trouble with the discovery part. So identity, what we think of as identity, we might also think of as a sort of identity, a discovery system for a lot of decentralized forms of internet that are going to be essential once they're there. And building in the meantime is kind of like playing my favorite Game Boy game from when I was a kid. It's called Pipe Dream. There was a version called Pipe Mania. I tried to figure out what it was called in Germany, never found it. That's what this little goofy video is. I don't like to think of it as a chicken and egg metaphor because there's only two terms, and it's a lot more complex than that. I like to think of it as doing plumbing with live pipes, or wiring electricity with the electricity turned on. And from the business side of this, use cases matter more than roadmaps. And imagining how useful something will be once all this is built is what's driving all of this experimentation and investment, rather than a more conservative software, what's the product, what's the market niche, how are we going to get money, right? So that little rule of thumb, that use cases matter more than roadmaps, is kind of a mentality shift that if you're coming from traditional software, this is important to get behind, right? Like the use cases are what's driving all of this, and people imagining different kinds of discovery, business models only possible with different kinds of identity or security or data integrity. That's what's important here. So if you ask the traditional oracles of the software industry where identity fits or where to invest, I don't always feel like they know yet, because it's 1918 and you're asking someone what's a good electrical appliance. There aren't toaster manufacturers yet. We don't even have the grid. And if you go to the blockchain journalism world, if you go to the websites people go to for intel in the blockchain world, I also feel like they also, in their way, get identity projects wrong a lot of times, because it's just the people writing those articles aren't coming from pre-SSI identity. They're not coming from infrastructure building mentality. They haven't seen something like SMTP go from an idea to an everyday reality for half the world. So it's like a different framework, right? So I think really, if you're trying to figure out how useful a product could be or an idea could be in this space, you have to go to the meetups. You have to go to these events. You have to meet the people. You have to directly get the intel, because the traditional channels of market wisdom aren't there yet. They're not. Sorry if that sounds a little esoteric or religious, but you have to take the leap of faith and talk to the believers. So I've been working for a year now, over a year, with Purple Tornado. We've been doing these reports that were commissioned by an unpopular branch of my government, I should say. I'm an American citizen. And the Department of Homeland Security is a very large, diverse group that does all kinds of things. In a way, it's kind of a catch-all. It does a lot more things than you would think. It was cobbled together from many different agencies. And one branch of this, the Science and Technology Directorate, was investing in a lot of research, speculation, proofs of concept, market research, and technical research having to do with different kinds of infrastructure generally. I mean, this is the same branch of government that's investing huge amounts of money in how secure can we make infrastructure. Should the computer system, the data networks of a dam be as vulnerable as the candy stores data systems, right? So a lot of their interest in SSI was, like I was saying, it's a more secure by design infrastructure for data. That's thinking about why they would be investing so much money in this is an indicator of the time span on which you have to be thinking to see the forest for the trees. So Anil John commissioned Purple Tornado. We've been working on these reports. Heather is a futurist, which is its own methodology. So she brings a sort of how will all this look if everything goes a certain way 20 years from now methodology to it. So she's really imagining new business models, and our reports have been based on trying to make a very accessible big picture for everyone involved, and not just the people coding this stuff or designing this stuff, but everyone throughout the sort of business community around software. And yeah, they're very much intended for interested parties at all levels of familiarity with both software design, cybersecurity, and the identity-specific stuff, the sort of who controls what information questions that are at the heart of identity and SSI. So this was the first book we did. I'm here in tiny letters. Marcus Sabadello from Vienna, that as a lot of people here in this room know, helped out with that report. Kim Duffy runs the W3C working group that catalyzes and organizes a lot of the conversation around the standards process to make sector-wide interoperability possible. So this book we wrote over a year ago. It already feels like 50 years old, but it's great. It's the book that you can get on Amazon to get a crash course on this stuff. And we've written 3 reports. This one's already out. It's on other uses for identity, right? So the default is always to think about the identity of individual people. But there's also plenty of things that have the rights or responsibilities of people, particularly in certain legal regimes. A legal entity or a legal person is interchangeable with a person in a lot of contexts. That identity needs to be just as secure, just as hashed, just as protected in some cases. And a lot of these smart devices, pacemakers connected to the internet, self-driving cars need to have the very best data controls, data provenance, tamper-proofing of data. So that report is there. I've got the bit.ly links if you are typing URLs into your phone. Here's an infographic from the forthcoming report. Comes out in a week or two. The final report of our grant about digital twins and asset passports. These are 2 ways of thinking about the identity of a set of data that corresponds to a thing that exists in the world. So, our playful example is a fish. It could be a car. It could be all kinds of things that have an identity. Anything that is a thing has an identity because it's a thing. If not, it would just be stuff. So anything identifiable can live on this infrastructure and have a rich digital life, maybe richer than its real life, or maybe its afterlife if it was a living fish, where you are organizing all the data that is important to that fish. And the fish is a good example because it's highly regulated. You have to ensure that it was caught in the right place by the right person, the right time of year to not usher in the collapse of the planet. So all that data is organized by an identity, right? So it sounds a little metaphorical, a little esoteric, but read the reports. It'll come into focus. It'll sound a little less esoteric. And of course, the distinction between digital twin and asset passport is kind of a design principle difference. So a digital twin might just be a bunch of unrelated entries in a bunch of different databases. And an asset passport is more oriented towards sort of a privileged view, like only one person controls a passport at any given time. Only the owner of the fish gets all the data, so it's like a little more of a closed container versus a a digital twin that might live in a lot of different places. So yeah. Also, if you're in the eGov sector, we also have a report on election data in the U.S., but applicable and interesting to people working on GovTech. So I mentioned that because there aren't manuals you can check, because everything's in beta, because everything is in a state of parallel development, people are working on all the parts in different places that need to work together and fit together and bridged across different standards and even across different blockchains. So much of what you would normally just look up in a manual or type into as search terms in a knowledge base, a lot of times, because all of these projects are so invested in working together, collaborating, they're more open than traditional software development. So these discussion collaboration platforms are often a lot more open than you would expect. You can just crash in there and say, hey, I'm trying to build something that works with your network for a project. I can't figure out how, why this thing keeps throwing an error, what's the variable it needs or something. These are generally pretty open, and I always encourage everyone starting working at one of these companies to get used to that sort of interaction, openness. And of course, GitHub, if you're building anything, you can look on the GitHub of the other people working on that set of tools, and the discussions are very active, very pertinent, and the W3C, the standards body working on all the SSI standardization is very open, very responsive. It's all there on the GitHub threads. You can really give yourself a crash course by just setting aside an afternoon to read the GitHub threads of the W3C. And yeah, there are different identity conferences that are more or less engaged with the decentralized identity space versus the traditional sort of enterprise identity IAM space. So IIW is sort of at the decentralized, free open source software end of the spectrum. Identiverse and No are a little more on the enterprise identity, the sort of identity industry side of things. Rebooting, the one we're all here talking about, is kind of bridges both. There's a lot of openness to anyone from any kind of project to come talk directly to engineers or just sit down at a table with people working on the same question they are and just hash it out. And one other resource I want to mention, in addition to my reports, which are a little more management oriented, non-technical oriented, there are also a lot of online communities, discussion boards that are not affiliated with any one player. The one I find the most interesting and robust is InfoMiner's one. So Source Crypto has been running for a few years. It's more of a general purpose place where people compare notes on self-educating around all kinds of blockchain topics, comparing different smart contract languages as they evolve and hopefully interoperate more easily. And InfoMiner's kind of a duocrat, believes in duocracy, so it's very open source. The discussions are open source, the tutorials are open source. If you're using it as an educational tool and you get stuck on step 4 of the tutorial, you can contact him, you'll talk, he'll send you all the information you need and then ask you to just change the tutorial yourself. Just go into GitHub and fix it, make it better, make it more understandable. So Did Essential is something we're starting soon, We've got some contributors that are a little more embedded in the space, and we're trying to make a self-sovereign identity specific version of his educational materials, right? So make tutorials, crash courses, work with people from the companies that want people to build on their platform, ensuring interoperability, facilitating sort of DIY testing, all this stuff. So yeah, that's another place you can look for more technical, hands-on self-education materials. I've committed to writing like a course or a tutorial. All these people here have each said, yes, we'll write one of the pages, we'll own a little page and evolve it over time as there's more to interoperate with and integrate. And yeah, I should mention, both of these sites have a sort of Discord twin. If Discord isn't too scary for you, it's like a weirder Slack. You can just go and do really direct contribution. Just here's a link, I don't understand it, or like, you know, here's a GitHub issue. Have other people had any experience with this? They haven't answered. Okay. Okay, so links. Thanks. Questions? Is there time left for questions?
Yeah, maybe you can tell us something about the SWIFT project with the banking transactions based in Belgium.
Actually, Heather, my boss at Purple Tornado, worked for Swift. But what's the question? Just to tell a general history of it?
Because I see them in competition to the blockchain.
Oh, as the settlements platform, you mean? Or?
Okay, if I make a Visa transaction, I do not use the SWIFT system. And if you make a Bitcoin transaction, you use the blockchain system. And the SWIFT system is linked to the USA, but it is not linked to China, not to Russia. And you just mentioned you did some consultation for the SWIFT company. Maybe you can tell something about that.
I did not. Heather did. But
I just saw it on your website, the SWIFT, with large letters, block letters, the SWIFT. The SWIFT system in Belgium.
Yeah. I know what you mean, but I have not personally worked with Swift in any capacity. And I think the Swift system, for better or for worse, was an infrastructural project to speed up the interconnection of banks, and there is an inside and an outside to the system. But I'm not sure how this relates to identity. Do you have like a?
So if I work in Deutsche Bank or I work in Hypovereinsbank, I use the SWIFT system. And if I use the Bitcoin, I use the Bitcoin blockchain. And the question is, now we have the Ripple blockchain. And what can you recommend Swift to develop the Swift system further? That's my question.
Okay, that's not exactly my field. I mean, I'm specialized in identity personally. I think in terms of the various blockchain projects, Ripple and Stellar, and now, for better or for worse, Libra, are coming into that space in a way that's closer to Swift, if I understand your question. And the relationship between sort of settlement systems and payment systems and identity is more technical than anything. So there's no inherent sort of relationship, right? So the some identity projects use only fiat, some use only crypto, some use both. Some have their own internal payment system. That level of implementation, figuring out who pays to keep the, to maintain the pipes, is very much up for debate, and it's actually the terms on which the different projects are competing to some degree. And SSI, to be decentralized and yet interoperable is the challenge. So the idea is that you might have parts of your identity in one corner of the pool where the validator pays for everything, and then have other parts of other data you control or own in another part of the pool, and they have to be able to see each other. You have to be able to present credentials that might live with different parties. So in a sense, the payment part is sort of like a granular detail, a granular differentiator between identity projects, and the rebooting conference and the the sort of cooperation between all the companies here today in the space is actually sort of happening on a different level. It's making sure the data can flow between these different systems, right? So I think there are a lot of ideological reasons to keep the payments question and the identity question independent. If I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or just talking. I don't know. Jörg?
I also like the idea of self-sovereign identity, and I also work in this area. But I see the speed of Facebook and Google and Amazon. They all provide own identity solutions. Even my GitHub identity says more about me than my self-sovereign identity that I currently can use. Do you really think that we have a chance with self-sovereign identity, and that the people will accept that they are more responsible for things, and that they can't totally forget their passwords and all the things, that the people take the responsibility? That is the one question. And the other question, do we have a chance against the big four, big five, or whatever you see there in this area?
Okay, maybe give me a time limit, because this could be a 2-hour answer. This is like another way of asking the same question is, are you wasting your life right now? I think what we're talking about building is a infrastructure, and I'm fairly confident that if and when it gets built, some people will use it in a very self-sovereign way. But, big but, most, yeah. Oh, have I done that wrong? I stole this graphic from some very nice people who are here. So I think the idea of self-sovereignty, much like all ideas of sovereignty, gonna talk politics here, are very contextual. So sovereignty is sort of an abstract concept, and in practice, most sovereignty is delegated, mediated. There's a lot of intermediaries in every other form of sovereignty. I think people are going to always, 99% of people who have cell phones have very few concepts available to them. They can't use anything that doesn't have a very friendly UX, a very simplifying UX. They think of each app as a representative of a company, and everything they do in that app is, in their experience in the sort of UX standards of 2019, data that company has. And SSI functions more on the GDPR level of abstraction, where things are baroquely classified into processors and subprocessors, and it's about formalizing and making a sort of ironclad technical structure within which everyone only has the data they need, data access is revocable, granular, you know, sort of SSI is a system for controlling data very well. How the end user will see it, I think, is I don't know. I can't imagine the toasters. It's 1918, and I don't know what toasters are going to look like. I think to some degree, most of the SSI platforms for people making SSI products for the verifiable claims about individual people are to some degree making an interface that makes this all less scary. 99% of people are not going to be keeping their private keys in cold storage. I mean, you know, my mom's never doing that. My mom's never doing that. She's never going to have a Ubi key with her private key on it. She will only use SSI if there's a company that looks trustworthy and that I tell her is trustworthy, and she will trust it. So I think in the sense of how it will actually be experienced by the end user, I think it's very early to say. I don't want to pick favorites and say this UX is more likely to get general adoption. I think there's so many steps between here and there that's anyone's guess. As for FANG, as for the big bad guys who are playing fast and loose with the entire world's data right now, I think that is also basically a political question of whether or not our journalistic and information flow and other flows of information are still healthy enough to get the general computer using, internet using public to understand the stakes of using one company or the other, or to see the sort of four-dimensional chess of data rights and data control. I think that I'm very optimistic that the tech lash is just starting, and that a year from now people will be even more mad because there will be even more scandals, and people will trust these robber barons even less than they do today. And I think the strategy there is really complicated. Maybe this is more of a one-on-one question. I'm seeing some eyes glaze over. But yeah, I think everyone in SSI, and definitely this is something that gets talked about constantly at Rebooting. So come to Rebooting and ask that question and watch discussion flare up. It really is complicated, but everyone knows that the big boys will make their sort of weakened, partial version of it that maybe meets some of these standards in one context and some of these standards in the other, but we think there will always be a niche for a few companies doing all 10 well. And hopefully we can force the big boys to interoperate if they figure out a way to, I don't know, convince people that some of these don't matter.
So thank you, Juan. And we will continue with the next speaker.